So tonight's panel is titled Art and Politics. The prompt is as follows. Over the question of the relationship of art and politics, two antinomies seem to dominate. One claims the inescapably political character of art, for example, the political art of the 1960s, the practices of which still persist to this day. The other end of this antinomy, to quote Susan Buck-Morss, diagnosing this tendency, argues that the images of art have no effect in the realm of deeds. Historically, however, the relationship between art and politics was posed differently. Images in the mind motivate the will, and thus have an effect in the realm of deeds, said Walter Benjamin in the 1930s. However, this doesn't seem to be a straightforward positive prescription about how to relate art and politics. What then is the relation, if any, between art and politics? What's the task of art today? What's the task of politics? How are both these tasks received by us in the present, and what kind of subjectivity do both presume? Can political goals be sought within art? If yes, how so? And if not, why? And our panelists in the order they'll be presenting are Seth Kim-Cohen, who teaches here at SAIC in the Department of Art History, Theory, and Criticism. He's the author of One Reason to Live, In the Blink of an Ear Towards a Non-Cochlear Sonic Art, Against Ambience, and forthcoming this year is Rock and Roll versus Modern Life. He was a 2021 Gray Center Mellon Fellow at the University of Chicago, working on a collaborative research project entitled Economic Objects, Capitalism as Medium. Seth is also a practicing musician and a retired artist. Jake Leech, who is a Chicago musician and multidisciplinary artist with a focus on photography, installation, sound, and media theory. He's also the host of the podcast Dynamics of. Rosalinda Falla, who combines analytic and embodied modes of artistic research to trace the ways racialized banishment, ecocide, indigenous dispossession, and extractive violence are encoded in everyday places. How did they coalesce around material forms and flows of capital, around institutions and forms of property, but also around modes of feeling, modes of relation? Her current projects focus on water spaces and glacial narratives. They include Underline Miami, Sea Level Rise, and Settler Futurities, Wisconsin Kansan, which is a book and walking project of Nicholas Brown and Lance Foster, Hydrologic Unit Code 071200, which is a text video installation of Andrea Carlson. Rosalinda is active in migrant solidarity and border abolition struggles. She's a core member of No Shelter, an activist media project exploring migrant child detention in the U.S. and the efforts to dismantle it. She works in museums, universities, art centers, community spaces, squats, and in the streets. And lastly, Micah Schippa, who is an artist, writer, and musician working in Chicago. They've recently shown at Salzburger Kunstverein, Austria, Spaß-Saturn, Russia, Scherben in Germany, with upcoming work at Lower Cavity, USA. Each of the panelists will have 6 to 8 minutes to give their opening remarks, and I'll let you know when they're running out of time. Or 6 to 10 minutes, rather. We'll follow that with a quick round of responses so the panelists can respond to each other, and then we'll open up for audience Q&A. So without further ado, I'm handing it over to Seth.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. And thanks to everybody from Platypus for inviting all of us. So 6 to 10 minutes is not a lot of time. I'm going to try to cram as much as I can into that frame, and we'll see what comes out of it. I think it's really hard to start to answer these questions or to respond to the prompt that Clay read without defining the two key terms, art and politics, but clearly we don't have time to do that in 6 to 10 minutes. But I think we need to, as we get into conversation about it, maybe start thinking about what we mean by those two terms. What qualifies as art? What qualifies as politics? At what levels do these two activities operate? And when do they intersect? But I think what I'd like to focus on for the time that I do have is a question about cause and effect, or different models of cause and effect. So if we're going to try to talk about how art might have political impacts, we have to kind of have a model of cause and effect. We have to think about how does this happen, under what conditions does it happen, under what time frames does it happen. And I think we can think about more kind of direct causal relationships, effects where we might be able to point kind of or draw a direct line from some kind of artistic activity to some kind of political political effect. And, just off the top of my head, the other day I jotted down a couple of these. We can think about Václav Havel and the Plastic People of the Universe in Czechoslovakia. We can think about, more recently, Pussy Riot in Russia. We can think about the Rock Against Racism movement in the UK in the 1980s. So, there are examples where a direct line can be drawn. We can still question exactly what the effects of the art was on the politics, if it was in fact the art, or if it was more other activities that were on the periphery of the art. That's a question worth asking. But what I want to try to focus on is what I think is the more common causal model, which is a more diffuse and indirect model, thinking maybe along the lines of the Benjamin quote that Clay mentioned earlier, that these things happen not directly, but through a way of sort of shifting perspectives, shifting ideas, opening audiences, readers, viewers, listeners to new perspectives, and then those new perspectives might lead to political activity, political action, new modes of thinking, new modes of acting. So to think about this, I wanted to just talk a little bit about the kind of central thesis of my new book that's coming out called Rock and Roll versus Modern Life. I'm a lifelong musician, and it's always occurred to me or seemed to me that music functions in a way that is often kind of ignored or not credited, which is that, again, it's not that music always has a kind of direct effect or direct impact on political activities, political attitudes even, but that something about music, along with the other arts, cinema, visual art, literature, whatever, but music can change the way people, especially young people, I think in many cases, see the world and can start to shift their own relationships to the structures in which they live, and that can be the beginnings of a politics. So as a very broad and contingent kind of definition for what I mean when I say politics, I might call it something like the organization of social life. And that would include lots of different things, from forms of government to the rights and responsibilities of people living in a particular place, economic models for the generation and distribution of wealth, also the protection from these processes, provision of services and support, all of these things that, again, I'm calling very generally the organization of social life. And the thing about all of these parts of the organization of social life is that they all depend on kind of operative understandings, and I'm using the word operative very intentionally here because I can't use a word like agreed upon, because they aren't ever agreed upon, but they are operative in some way. They can be operated upon. Operative understandings of categories, distinctions, hierarchies, canons, and so on. And in order for us to have these operative models of distinctions, let's just stick with that word for now, that operative model needs to rest on some kind of ontological understanding of categories, of what a thing is, of what one thing is, perhaps relative to another. That's the only way we can distinguish between A and B, is to have some kind of, ontological model. And to my mind, Western modernism, the Enlightenment, whatever you want to call it, has insisted, over the past 300 years, to pick a somewhat random number, on a kind of an essentialist ontology, an ontology that puts a lot of faith in the thing in itself, to use a kind of Kantian turn of phrase. So the thing in itself can give us certain categories that operative political models then use to organize social life. So, some obvious examples: male, female, black, white, gay, straight, etc. These are categories that are based on a certain ontological understanding of what a thing is and how to distinguish one thing from another. And that ontological model has underwritten the politics of the Western world, again, for the past roughly 300 years, if not longer. But the politics that or what drives my politics is a kind of Derridian understanding of ontology, drawn from the French philosopher Jacques Derrida, which would be an anti-essentialist ontology right down to the most fundamental levels. There is nothing at the base, nothing that grounds any ontological category. Instead, any ontological category is a play of differences, is what Derrida would say. Only through differences can we understand what something is. And whatever something is always constituted, at least in part, by what it is not. So every category is has embedded within it the trace, another Derridian word, of what it is not. Almost done here, just in case you're keeping time. So for instance, the thing we call female depends on the thing we call male. And of course, in the structures of Western society, one of those categories is always privileged. So the category of female benefits the male. The category of black benefits white. The category of gay benefits straight. But that's only if you're buying into this ontological model that is essentialist, that accepts that those categories are discrete, identifiable, stable, universal. If you don't buy into that, if you're anti-essentialist, the way that Derrida is, then those categories cease to function in the way that Western politics would like them to function. So in the past 40, 50, 60 years, it seems to me that essentialism has been attacked from various angles in the West. Maybe, at least in my research, I'm most familiar with the US context. So the angles in which that essentialism has been attacked over the past few decades would include things like Black Power, feminism, gay rights, the anti-war movement, but also, I think, in ways that are not overtly political. Philosophical movements like post-structuralism, and for me, again, Derrida is key here, his critique of what he calls the metaphysics of presence. But even in things like conceptual art, which to me is an anti-essentialist approach to art, and then in my mind and in my art history kind of births all the important anti-essentialist art movements that have resulted since, but also things like street theater, absurdist protest, and finally for me, rock and roll is part of that project as well. And I probably don't have time to go into that in any greater detail, but we can certainly talk about it in conversation. So that's it for me. Thanks for listening.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jake Leech, like was said previously. I am definitely, as I said to my fellow panel mates, the yokel of the panel, or so I feel. I did not attend art school, although that was often celebrated. When I briefly worked at a very small art gallery here in town, I was paraded around at parties saying that, guess what, this is Jake, and he didn't go to art school, and everyone clapped, and so it feels great to be in the, thank you. I don't know how I feel about that, because art school seems pretty cool, but a little bit about me, I'm a musician as well, and only since about 2018 did I allow myself to kind of foray into the visual arts. I was handed a film camera by some friends, and the rest has been keeping me up at night, which is great. My art schooling, though, as I often like to say, is Google and the homies. Those are my two sources for knowledge and coming to places like this. And so getting to know a few people around town through Instagram is why I'm here today. So I'm very proud to be here. Thank you all for being here. I think getting at what we're talking about in terms of politics and art, I feel like I need to lean on what it is that I'm most interested in and the things that I tend to see. So I feel like my understanding of all of this is going to be very recent past, and even in some ways sometimes like things that happened literally yesterday. I kind of got really into more understanding the dissemination of images through like reading, I think I've read 8 pages total of On Photography by Susan Sontag, but I'll get there someday. But through that, even that 6 or 8 pages I've read is enough for me to understand that photography itself as an art form is a really interesting battleground for this concept of politics versus art, or however we want to think about it. We talked when Seth brought up like recent movements and things where we see that art and politics, and I've been kind of associating through my notes and researching for this as politics as an extension of power. Well, politics is power, but you understand what I'm saying is that like art at odds with power, and something that I could think of recently in terms of photographic work or photographers that are doing or getting into that is like Nan Goldin, for instance, is subject of the new film, all the Beauty and the Bloodshed. Thank you. This is why we're on a panel, which is showing at Gene Siskel on April 15th. So go see it. That it's about her battle with addiction through pills, and how her fight against the Sacklers and their influence and name everywhere on every major museum across the planet. And through that, she used art, as many of you probably are aware, we are in an art school. She put on basically performance works or protests within these institutions, often having the Sackler name, like on empty bottles of the prescription drugs themselves, but then the ingredients are like death, for instance. And there's these really beautiful shots of, these things being thrown down the halls of the Guggenheim and things of that nature. And in spoiler alert, her work has done, her protest worked in a lot of ways. The name has been removed from so many institutions, and I was thinking about that though. It's like, okay, that's great, hoorah, we did it. And, I can understand that, well, that's just the Sacklers. What about the oil people? What about people that have investments in the art world? Nan Goldin seemingly was established in the art world. Her name is emblazoned across history. Like, of course she could take this time with power and her art to do that. And I think there's only so much we can solve as one individual. And obviously for Nan Goldin's life, this was an incredibly serious thing that she needed to, and was very successful, and will continue to inspire people through that. Using the medium of, in this case, film, it was directed by Laura Poitras. But what I'm getting to that with is that there's this Adam Curtis phrase, the director, called "oh dear-ism," that he talked about in terms of the Rwandan genocides, and that basically when we saw that on the news, that there wasn't clear to American audiences or Western audiences who the good person was and who the bad person was. There was genocide across all sides, and that we couldn't help but just be overwhelmed by it. And because we are inundated with images at all times through our phones in a post-internet universe, that we've kind of taken in that oh dearism of what can I do, what I'm unable to understand what is going on. So what I need to do is, I have, as a millennial, I have no buying power. I'll never afford a house, and all the other quips we tend to say at parties and things like that. So what can I do? I can put, some infographic on my Instagram, because that's the only power we have is our clout, and so thus this is where, like, for a variety of reasons, good, bad, and different, cancellation comes involved and things like that, things I don't need to explain to you guys. But what I find is that with politics and art, that being forced to have to reckon with power or politics in your art is inherently the division of, I think, what the past or the times that we've cite as times that we wish we were part of. People like to say, like, oh, there was a time when my parents could work a regular job and pay their way through art school. We can't do that now. Being able to take a sort of peacetime understanding of what it is to make whatever art we want, and not being forced to put politics into our art, because that is the only way we can have agency. We have no buying power, so we must put our politics into our art, because that's the only way I can express my art. And what I kind of view, I kind of, just to wrap here and hopefully move the mic on, within the poster for this, it was like, what is the task of art today and the task of politics today? And so my brief summation of all this, and appreciate you all bearing with me, is that to me, the task of art today is to reflect and or decipher our post-internet world. And the task of politics today, for better or worse, maybe you could see this as a good faith or bad, I don't know, but in a lot of ways it seems to be to own the other side, to have flawless rhetoric and bulletproof record, to own I said that twice, sorry, and to amass clout amongst our fellow constituents. So that was really random and fully kind of all the thoughts I've had in the last few days trying to lead up to this, but I'm very curious for all of us to get into all these subjects. So thank you.
Okay. Hi, I'm Rosalinda. Hi, everybody. So I don't have much time, so I'm going to get right to it. What I want to talk about is finance. And then we'll see how that leads us to art and politics. But for me, that's like kind of the central point. And it's specifically about something called social finance. I don't know if y'all have heard about this. Stop me if anything's too familiar and I shouldn't blabber on. Or people also refer to it as the social turn in finance. This is a framework that's sort of emerged with increased vigor and coherence in the wake of the multiple kind of crises of the global financial system, from the sort of IMF crises to the subprime mortgage crises, and now to like climate change governance, right? And so it's a kind of framework for a political framework for envisioning finance as the kind of primary realm where social and technological innovation will occur that will address and solve the world's most pressing problems. This is an extremely powerful, dominant framework, politically speaking. So this might sound familiar to us in many manifestations, some of which include things like the private-public partnership as the most normalized sort of modality of planning and governance, the rise in prominence of philanthrocapital, the extension more and more deeply into all areas of social organization of things like the nonprofit sector, and the importance and prominence of foundations on every aspect of cultural and political life. So this idea of finance as sort of solving social problems, or like social finance and social investing, works to recast what are essentially the crises inherent in racial capitalism and colonialism as crises that are social problems or environmental problems that are then to be solved by finance. Crises that are often talked about as like the failure of the public sector. We might have heard that before. And it works also to recast particular populations as problem populations or as risky, socially risky populations. The old parlance was like at risk, now it's risky. Or they're also called subprime populations, you might have heard that. So it's the sort of idea that certain populations put everyone else at risk, right? Put the state at risk, or the public sector at risk, or the private-public partnership that's seeking to find good solutions, right, is put at risk by certain populations. Or even the financial system as a whole. So once crises are reconfigured into particular kinds of problems, and once populations are reconfigured into problem and risky populations, they're sort of subsequently reconfigured again as potential assets, or as assets that are worth taking risks on, which would be highly investable or highly attractive to investors. And so, like, how does this actually happen, right? How does philanthrocapital, how does big finance, like, invest in, according to this framework of social finance? And how does this become sort of a dominant framework in politics today? So I'm going to lean heavily on the work of Zinnia Quiche and Justin Leroy, who have tried to theorize some of this in a text they call Bonded Life. It's remarkable. It's really short for how dense it is, and I think it's a great start to this conversation. They look at the legacy or the histories of finance beginning from, let's say, slave bonds, right, and to today, and to these forms that are specific to social finance. And they zero in at particular forms or particular technologies, such as the social impact bond. This might sound like just a financial instrument, but it's actually a way to visualize in a concrete form what is a much larger logic of power that is sort of greatly exceeds the realm of finance proper, and is actually kind of sort of with us here today, in a very deep way. It's hard to like put our finger on it. But a social impact bond is like one kind of instrument to like look at. And what it does is an instrument that incentivizes financiers to invest in social interventions or in social rehabilitation projects. Presumably funding projects and programs that target risky or at-risk populations will then produce specific kinds of measurable outcomes. Measuring these outcomes then also allows for them to be considered in terms of price value, right? And then these outcomes stand in for sort of social benefits. And these outcomes can be seen to be equivalent to a kind of positive social gain that lowers the cost burden of these populations on the public sector later on. And so this kind of calculation then allows the investors to receive dividends from the presumed savings on future public costs. Is any of that clear? Or is it kind of like wacky? All right, should I give one example? All right, so if you read Bonded Life, their examples are way better, but and terrifying. But I thought I'd pick one from Chicago, because hey. So there's an instrument that was produced in Chicago. It's 2014. It's a partnership between the city of Chicago, CPS, public school system, the Metropolitan Family Services, and a whole range of social service organizations, right, because it's involved in the nonprofit and service sector. And there's a lot of nonprofits that are intermediaries, and the investors are Goldman Sachs, Northern Trust, and the Pritzker Family Foundation. So all these financiers and public and nonprofit partners got together, and they created a program that is an intervention program on 5-year-old at-risk children. So read like poor black folks, poor black kids from certain neighborhoods. That would be part of this program to sort of improve their chances of success in school. And the idea is that once they move through the program, there are benchmark kind of assessments or benchmark outcomes that are desirable. And as long as the children perform according to these benchmarks, this indicates that they will need fewer services in the future in school, right? So there'll be less need for, let's say, a counselor in school, less need for social service education. Thus, the city and CPS will save money in the future, right? And so against these future savings, the current investors make their profits, make their dividends, which have been every year since 2014 upwards of 20%. It's probably the best investment that you can have right now. So this really sort of, you can sort of look at this and really critique it and theorize it as a way of capitalizing on and speculating on the potential of particular kinds of lives. And that's what sort of they call bonded life, right? A sort of a racialized life as having become the underlier of financial speculation. And I kind of extend that notion to think about ecosystems as well when it comes to carbon trading, when it comes to like things like wetland banking and the ways that, you know, green capitalist sort of solutions to climate change are very much about reducing all forms of life, human, non-human, more than human, to these kinds of sort of speculative investment instruments, so that there are different forms of calculation and forms of government or governing that can render all aspects of our existence amenable to this kind of calculative logic. Social finance, then, is a kind of broad form of social power that can reconcile what it considers present social risks with desirable outcomes in the future for investors. So why did I want to start with this really long, kind of crazy thing about social finance? Because I know most people don't care much about finance. But I think it's one way for me to enter into this question about political power, which sort of greatly exceeds the realm of finance. But interestingly, social finance privileges art as a sector where a lot of social innovation happens. Art is actually sort of being reconfigured, and has been in the last 30 to 40 years, as being the primary sector for social finance kind of investing. And that's because it deals with like experimental imaginaries, experimental socialities, with like things like what are we incubating possible futures and innovative solutions to problems. This isn't just about kind of like social practices. It's kind of reimagining imagining of art's position socially and politically, right? But who's imagining this politics, and who's imagining these solutions, right? And in whose image of what kind of future is the sector of art being reconfigured to provide political alternatives? What are the kinds of, not just the imaginaries, but also the modes of relation and affects, modes of feeling that are necessary to kind of produce this future envisioned by the financiers? And I would say, there's a lot that we can talk to about specifically how that plays out in what gets funded in this unbelievably awash with funds sort of global art sector. I think it's pretty grotesquely over-invested. Clearly, this framework really identifies particular kinds of problems in types of socialities that are seen as risky, because they're insurgent, because they're sort of outside of or against the logic of capital, because they exceed the logic of capitalization, they exceed the kind of social order, and I would say they exceed also the sort of realms of sociality that are limited to human subjects. And Fred Moten and Stefano Harney call this kind of identification and prospecting of insurgent socialities a sort of primary technique of governance. So, finance and the types of art that it's trying to produce and reconfigure are really counterinsurgent in many ways. And I think for those of us who have some kind of attachment to any of those technologies or practices that fit into this kind of category called art, I think we're being drawn into and mobilized within a series of really violent, racialized technologies that's, not as benign as it seems. And I think it feels like soft power often, but it's actually, you're seeing more and more examples of where it's not that soft. And again, many of them are happening in Chicago right now. Some of the biggest art projects and investments are like unbelievably fucked up, and overtly so, right? This framework of like social good is holding nonetheless. So my interest would be to sort of look at the problem from there and to say not is what is art and politics, as I think finance capital knows very well what's the sort of political function of art. But I would sort of wonder, what are the political antagonisms that are possible within this kind of formation? Is it really possible to still like foment political antagonism, and if so, how? Is it really possible to push back against the kind of socialities that are being produced coercively and that we're supposed to be the authors of, right? We're supposed to make experimental artworks that are like walking in the city, walk, but don't trespass and don't jump the fence, and by all means don't bring your bolt cutters and cut the fence, right? We're supposed to make art about the Anthropocene, but don't sabotage the pipeline. We're supposed to do creative placemaking, but don't burst shit up or don't squat, right? There are very particular kinds of socialities and practices that are to be produced, and others that are to be rendered illegible, criminalized, and eliminated. And I think part of the policing of the possibilities of socialities is really the sort of army of artists that's being unleashed upon the world right now. That's like us. So I'd sort of wonder, like, what would it mean for us to refuse to be part of these kind of reconfigurations? What would it mean for us to recognize that insurgent socialities are constantly being produced before, outside of, in excess of the logic of finance, that these socialities are produced in moments of and contexts of struggle and revolt. They don't necessarily want to be legible to art. We shouldn't fucking make art about them, in other words, right? And sell that art or author it. They don't necessarily want to be legible to, the private-public partnership that is solving the problems of the world, right? So how to kind of become aware of and contribute to insurgent imaginaries and refuse to do the work of reconfiguring them in the interests of art and capital. So I'd kind of, and is it possible then to treat art as a terrain of struggle anymore? I think that's kind of a question. So I'll stop there because I think I'm out of time. Thanks.
Hi. I just want to say, thanks for coming out. This is really great. I think it's really cool that these kind of questions are being asked. I hope that these kind of questions are being asked in the classroom. At this school. So I actually wrote something. It might be a little overbaked, and I wrote it more as kind of a just a quick kind of cathartic exercise in hyperbole about a sort of centralized art world that we are all too familiar with. So I'm just going to read this just because it's easier for me to do that. Because of neoliberalism, financial, or what I call terminal capitalism, art has reached its cumulative endpoint as pure debris. Art fairs bear no distinguishable features from landfills, except that in only one of these places you will find both wage slaves and wealth criminals. Art museums, like art fairs, are also puppets of corrupt corporate interests, which function to propel the illusion of a liberal humanist state in front of what is actually a war machine. It is true that any kind of art can become entangled with the paranoia that is nationalism, and this is the dualism with which we are faced. In this context, curators and gallerists act not just as gatekeepers, then, but also as jailers. Curators, especially given their unique non-profit position as conduits between the corporate boards they answer to and the masses for which they curate, are responsible for art's complete cosmic annihilation. Curators, by their unwillingness to address the true social inequality or revolutionary methods of distributing artistic acts, objects, and ideas to the people, maintain, with administrative piety, the fetid status quo. At best, they are hypocrites and class traitors, and at worst, they are complicit propagandists. Because curators, and to a lesser extent gallerists, have sole control over what gets culturally remembered, they have the greatest responsibility to act in the interest of the working class, yet they consistently choose to ignore real revolutionary possibilities. If art in its ideal form is a dialogue of the possible, then curators act as silencer, as gag order, as thought police. Curators and not artists themselves control the narrative. I hope none of y'all are curators in the crowd tonight. The art world is literally awash in blood money, so it is no surprise that art has been weaponized by the feudal state in which we all exist, because all it knows how to do is weaponize. Art is now deployed as an alienating mechanism against the working class. Art's utility today is no different than it was a millennia ago under the divine right of kings. It is meant to adorn palaces, corporate offices, mansions, and state houses, and to establish a metaphysical legitimacy to power, simultaneously operating as a means to launder as much money as possible and to extort a social capital in service of the psychopathic narcissism of the rich. This is not to say that there is not great art being made in our time. It is merely our reality that the Euro-American market model of the art world is all-encompassing and automatically discounts and expels whatever antagonizes it or operates at its periphery. Like post-human industrialism, its goal is to subjugate and extract profit from every possible atom in the universe and to annihilate that from which it cannot, or perhaps to find profit in the very process of annihilation. I believe to address this problem, we must stop asking ourselves if art is political or has power, and instead ask ourselves if artists are revolutionaries and if artists have power. We don't have to burn down the museum or the gallery, but we can expunge from cultural necessity the board of trustees, the curators, the fair organizers, and the gallerists, and replace them with something new, something proletarian, something real. We must ask ourselves as artists if we are capable of producing anything more than just a market commodity. Art is a form of critical thinking as opposed to mindless operating. It is a diverse, heterodox assemblage of ideas, experimental togetherness, historical movements and struggles animated by an anti-authoritarian impulse, that is, a desire to critically interrogate, refuse, transform, and/or overthrow all relations of authority. Because, in one way, the authority of end-stage capitalism seeks the destruction of free, irrational, expressive being, and in another way, because it seeks to subsume and subjugate any errant, stochastic manifestations of creativity, art's deeply paradoxical task is to resist the proscriptive. Art is a dialogue of the possible. Its task is to endlessly examine, question, and harass any presuppositional act or claim to power, authority, or centrality. Art, in its ideal form, is a kind of sublime cataclysm. June Jordan, in talking about poetry, extrapolates what I hope can be true about art. She said, "And so poetry is not a shopping list, a casual disquisition on the colors of the sky, a soporific daydream, or bumper sticker sloganeering. Poetry is a political action undertaken for the sake of information, the faith, the exorcism, and the lyrical invention that telling the truth makes possible. Poetry means taking control of the language of your life. Good poems can interdict a suicide, rescue a love affair, and build a revolution in which speaking and listening to somebody becomes the first and last purpose to every social encounter. Thank you.
There we go. So thank you to our panelists. We're now going to open up to responses between you all. Maybe I'll just to kind of open up these responses, I'll underline a kind of through line between all of you. There does seem to be this question underlying all of this of the 60s, the legacy of the 60s. Something that seemed to go through all of you guys' remarks is that art has to do at some level with the question of power. There is this, you brought up, Seth, the new social movements of the 60s, but there seems to be, with our two younger panelists, this other thing happening where there's this, actually with the other three panelists, of the sort of discontents of the results of the new social movements, specifically neoliberalism, which in some ways is a result of those movements. Yet, the thing that does seem to be underlying all of this is all of this has to do with the question of political power. And yet the thing that is precisely what is discontented against by the three younger panelists is that same legacy in which that question really emerged, or at least is forefronted for us, of the question of what's the relation of power and art. Maybe another thing would just be if the question is power, then why art at all? Is the other thing. Instead of just doing politics, why do we have to do it in this mediated way? That seemed to be kind of addressed to a certain extent by Jake's remarks when he was talking about the task of politics is the accumulation of clout and also perfect rhetoric against one's political opponents. Yeah, I'll just leave it right there, but let's have the addresses. And the same order as the presentation.
I'm not sure how I feel about being pegged as the older panel member, but that's okay. I'll get over it. More experience. Okay. I'll wear it proudly. Yeah, so just for those of you who are going to school at SAIC, I teach a class here called How to Be a Neoliberal Artist in 14 Easy Lessons, which is concerned specifically with neoliberalism and artists' role, within a neoliberal system. 14 Easy Lessons, that's the number of weeks in the semester. You may have figured that out. And the title of the class is definitely meant to be sarcastic, so we're not actually teaching you how to be a neoliberal artist. But obviously it's a question, and it is a question that emerges, I think rightly, as you pointed out, Clay, from a legacy of the 60s, both on the side of, on three sides at least, the economics, if you look at the economic transitions from the 60s through the 80s up to the present day, there's a very clear movement in one direction, the direction of neoliberalism. And if you read certain authors who have been very good at describing these transitions, somebody I particularly like is Quinn Slobodian, who wrote a really great book called Globalists about the transition into a neoliberal world order. And he just last week wrote a really good op-ed in the New York Times about, these zones, these kind of free trade zones, and which definitely intersects with some of what Rosalinda was talking about, places where, art dealers can sort of store their stuff in a little port somewhere without paying any customs or taxes on it. And basically they have this kind of economic zone that exists outside of nation state regulation. So Quinn Slobodian just wrote a really good piece about that and how that in many ways is really driving the global economy at this stage. It's not a nation state issue anymore. It's not particularly a corporate issue even anymore. It's now this kind of free trading zone kind of economy. So anyway, I was talking about three things: the economy, the politics, moving from the 60s to the present day. You can draw very clear and simple lines from, anti-war and civil rights movements through the election of Nixon, through eventually the election of Reagan, and then Reagan Jr., Bill Clinton, and then on through the Bushes, right up to the present day. And so many of the people involved in Nixon's campaign and administration were also involved in Trump's, if we can call that an administration, his circus. And then the other through line would be from the 60s would be the art world. And for me, maybe unlike the other three presentations, I'm interested in thinking about this word art as a much broader thing than just what gets shown at the Art Institute or in galleries on Randolph Street or that are funded by foundations who are funding the arts. I'm interested in all kinds of cultural production that slip through those cracks that are not part of that economy. And I think maybe that's one thing we can talk about as a panel is all those other modes of cultural production and what they're doing, how they're doing it, and whether there can be political efficacy, sort of outside of the network of the kind of economics that Rosalinda was talking about.
That actually works quite nicely for the stuff that I meant to talk about during my part, was that a white guy with a podcast up here. Oh God. There is this podcast. There's two. One's done by Joshua Citarella. If you all are familiar with him, it doesn't really have a title. It's just his name. And then an affiliated one is New Models. And something they talk about constantly is kind of exiting exactly the economy you're saying of, art school or going through, the gallerist system or, whatever it may be, trying to get your work sold by lizard people or whatever. But that like we're in a world with like Patreon, for instance. We're in a world with which is owned is a major conglomerate. But outside of that, what I think that people are finding is that they want to exit. Leave society, if you will, or find the secret third thing. I have to speak in memes because that's just what I'm in my late 20s, early 30s. So what I think that, I think the theoretical ideal of what we're looking for is I'm glad you used the word sublime, Micah, because that was a word that felt right to me. It's kind of like being able to have sublime indifference to our politics and our art creation, to sort of being able to exit from these things, to not have to be forced to make art a certain way, to be within an economy of art, but also that if that is true, I guess what are the effects of that and why? What are we? At some point it's like gallerists or galleries or something like that are just selling an item, like what's it going to take to get you into a Paul Sequoia today, something like that it basically is like car sales or anything else. But I think artists wanting to have some sort of livelihood and still exist and have art be part of their world, there seems to be the regular treaded paths, but then also newer ones, whether that be through, panhandling on the information superhighway or whatever that may be. I think that people are seeking, like that of the title of the podcast I mentioned, new models. They're attempting to find new models to support our art careers, but our art abilities, being able to, I recorded an episode with a local artist here, Sam Dybeck, and something we talked about how we want to have a 9-to-5 and we want to make art at the end and to have be part of a group show every so often and just have fun. And then I had friends respond. They were like, hell yeah. And then I had some friends that were like, I don't think anyone actually believes that. I think everyone wants to be the capitalist thing they say if the offer came down the line. So again, this is kind of a shotgun response to everything we're talking about, but these are some things I wanted to hit in response.
Thank you. So to the thing that you were saying, Seth, about art that is not like within what the institutional art markets. And I think that's what I was sort of referring to as, like the constant proliferation of insurgent socialities that actually don't want to be legible as art, right? They don't want to be legible to the curator and the gallery and the art fair or the art department, even the social practices art department, right? And that in the continuous sort of, the reason I want to talk about the social turn in finance is because I really want to talk about the social turn in art, right? I really want to talk about the ways in which, sort of operating upon the realm of the social has become a giant market in a way that maybe it wasn't 30, 40 years ago, right? And that like producing socialities that are docile and that are problem solving, right? That are proper stakeholders, right? In this kind of partnership with various technologies of power seems like it's exerting a great course of force upon people who have any kind of attachment to like thinking about the future, and so like thinking about like what we might be needing to confront and what we might need to sort of like get ourselves to be collectively willing to do, right? If we're going to ask questions through creative ways or through embodied ways or through imagery or through language or through music, right? Like what are the kinds of refusals that we might have to be prepared to sustain and endure? And that means, how do we support each other in doing that, right? How do we survive in doing that? Where are our commitments, right? Like I struggle because I'm really committed to making images, and that's really fucked up a lot of times, right? That really messes with my politics a lot of times, especially when I'm part of more kind of radical or like marginal, movements that are organized differently, where that kind of shit is really known as something that's dangerous, right? And so where people collectively have the political intelligence to say, don't like render any of this activity legible to anyone on the outside, right? Well, you don't want people to know we're doing this shit, like why are you making images? This is like really important forms of kind of sociality and inventiveness and transformative activity that does not want to be legible to the creative activity that we think of as art. And so I'm on the one hand, like as a person who still has some tangential relationship with this art thing, and participate in various kind of marginal art circuits, I still want to think that art has, political or emancipatory potential. And on the other hand, I'm just wondering, like, why would anyone assume that? Why would we assume that, when we're looking at how capitalism is organized at the top, they seem to know exactly what the political potential of art is, and it's just like this policing of every form of existence, and a kind of pre-order of the universe in the image of capital. So these are, I think, but I meet people all the time who are in many ways asking these same questions and struggling with these same contradictions. And I think we experience them in an individual level, like we're in our bedrooms like, oh, what the fuck, But actually they're not individually produced crises, right? These are systemically produced crises. And so if we can like collectivize our anxieties and struggles around these things and recognize that we're just like, how we're mobilized and how we're supposed to be, like the only easy solution is just to be a perpetrator of these racialized technologies. Then it's fucking easy. Then you can be like, have some image of success in front of you and only agonize if you fail. I wasn't picked for that art fair, But really that's kind of the simple agony, right? It's not like fucking existential or something. So I think like if we could sort of have these kinds of conversations among people who have some kind of loose affiliation or still like recovering artists like me, and especially outside of those contests, right? Especially making sure that we have commitments and deep participation in communities where the art thing is not what people are looking towards as where kind of political radical imagination happens, and they have a learned historical distrust of that. I think that would be really cool. I think that would be really helpful. So that's just kind of why I wanted to talk about finance, because it seemed to me like that's one way of talking about the ways in which I see art being groomed to be more and more the realm of operationalizing and weaponizing the social in really specific ways.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I want to go back to something, Seth, that you said about the sort of, I think if we change the terms legible and illegible to central and peripheral. I think one of the reasons that I am thinking about that central aspect is because it's always there and it's always pervasive, right? Like the central, like capital A art market exists, and then there's the, you know, subaltern stuff on the edge, on the periphery. And my question for myself, which I've never answered, is, you know, or one of my suspicions is that, like, what's on the edge is always getting in the process, like, of being subsumed by the center. So how do you deal with the center, even though it kind of seems passé, right? Like, you could just, like, I mean, like, yeah, I brought up art fairs and, like, museums, and it's like, yeah, okay, nothing, like, political happens there. But also then I think, like, does it? You know, I think, like, when I think about when I was first, like, exposed to, like, contemporary art, it was, like, a really, like, mind-blowing experience, and it has led me down this path of political thinking. So I question, like, you know, my own sort of bitterness towards that central system. Like, is it possible for things to still happen there and at the periphery? And then I think something that to me relates to something you just said about, like, kind of togetherness. I think that something that interests me is this, like, that very act that we're here sort of is, like, interesting, and that I think what is different now that is unlike any other previous sort of generation is that there's more administrators and sort of, like, corporate people in the art world more than ever before. And I think, like, if we can form a kind of, like, union of artists where artists are controlling the narrative and not these sort of, like, bureaucratic financiers, the capitalists. Like, I think that is kind of where I'm thinking recently, like if we can sort of, like, blow up the center in service of the periphery. Like, I don't want to give up on the center because I think it's like important. And not that that's what you were saying either, but I mean, yeah, I think, like, what I wrote in some ways is kind of passé because it is, like, who fucking cares about this, like, centralized, you know, art world. But then I think also we have to continue to think about it, or at least I do, because it's like so incredibly evil and horrible. Yeah, so I don't know. I think, like, I've been thinking a lot about who controls the narrative, what art is, what art's purpose is, what it can function as, because, like, the neoliberal system is so easy at just eating and consuming whatever it, like, sees as antagonizing it. Because, like, I think something you said, like, that we're in neoliberalism was sort of, you know, a result of the context of, like, avant-garde art in the 60s, which is very true. So in some ways it's, like, a very, what do we do? You know, like, if we're constantly creating for the condition, if we're constantly creating the conditions of the future, what do we do in the present as artists?
Okay, I'm going to thank you to all the panelists. I'm going to transfer it. I'm going to open up the floor for questions from the audience. Please raise your hand if you have a question. I'll call on you. I'll deliver you the microphone. Anyone? Itzy.
Hi. Thanks for everyone coming. I think a general theme that was running through most of the panelists' remarks is this kind of anti-Western narrative, like the grand narrative, in favor of this, like, postmodern idea of multiplicities. And I guess my question is, what was the initial idea of art? As in, what was art just like a mere, like, pastime, or did it do something? Was it a critique of our own moment? And in some ways, how does a crisis of art under capitalism today pose a critique of our lack of being able to change society qualitatively? And how does this one-sided rejection of this initial idea of art as a posing like a critique of our ability to change society. How are we avoiding that in our turn to to postmodernism, or is it what does postmodernism offer us today? Yeah, hopefully that made sense.
Anyone who would like to respond first? No order this time.
Give it a go. As I start to respond, tell me if I'm going down the wrong path. I'm not sure I fully understood the question, but what I would start by saying is that maybe we can avoid the term postmodernism because it's loaded with all kinds of baggage, most of it not very helpful. But I do think it's worth thinking about something after modernism, because if we think of modernism either in an art context in terms of a kind of a history of the visual arts from, say, the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century, or if we think about a kind of high modernism in the mid-20th century with the ascendancy of abstract expressionism, there's definitely some lessons to be learned in all of that, and we're not living in that world anymore, artistically, aesthetically, financially, politically. But we can also think of modernism in a much broader societal sense as something that's, roughly coextensive with the Enlightenment and all the harms of the Enlightenment. So I try to stay away from the term postmodernism because, as I say, it's just loaded with a bunch of unhelpful baggage. But I do think it's necessary to think about how lots of institutions and systems and modes of thought, modes of practice have emerged from an era that we might comfortably call modernism. And again, that includes all the things we've already talked about today. Neoliberalism is often theorized as a kind of a mode of capitalism that emerges after the kind of height of what we might call a modernist capitalism. And it's aided by technologies that simply weren't available in the 50s and 60s. It's aided by new logics, new languages, new instruments, and lots of new, not sure what to call them, the kind of systems that evade regulatory control, all kinds of tricks that have been up the sleeves of the bankers and the investors and politicians, and have been deployed very strategically over the past 30, 40, 50 years. So I think we do need to think of ourselves as living in an era after modernism, but postmodernism to me is not a helpful term. Did that go anywhere near what you were asking about? Are you sure? Okay. Anybody else want to try to think that through?
I want to pick up on, I heard you say something about the crisis of art being able to actually feel transformative. And I do think that's, we're in so many crises, but I do think that's one of the questions, that a lot of us are facing is in sort of reckoning with the depth of the sort of harms, structurally speaking, that we're in the midst of. What are the possibilities for transformation, and where might those horizons for transformation be, and how do we engage with them, right? Like I have only so much time, and I only live once, and I want to, be proximal to spaces and forms of practice and forms of living that can feel, at least some of the time, transformative. Otherwise, why the fuck wake up in the morning, is bleak. And so those I think those modes of relating and modes of creating sometimes maybe can look like art, and sometimes look like something, they look like a blockade, sometimes, frankly. And I think, but I do have friends and compañeros from south of the colonial border who often, bring with them a lot of a wealth of evidence of like various forms of creative expression that are collectively understood as art making of different kinds, and that emerge from within, social struggles and struggles of liberation. And I think like we don't really have that here, right? Because I think we don't have liberatory struggles at those scales, right? Where it's like you don't ask a question about art and politics, you're asking a question about transformative expression in the context of opening up spaces of struggle, And so I think these questions are maybe the crisis is maybe a crisis of social movements and a crisis of like political struggle and political revolt. In the absence of political revolt, we're trying to say like it's kind of like an echo chamber, where is the transformative imagination? I'm really curious how like these shifts and kind of ontological challenges then have some kind of afterlife or generate possibilities for other kinds of transformation, right? Or if it's like these shifts can be completely absorbed, But I think it's like the echo chamber of a certain sort of lack of revolt at a certain types of proximity to daily life and a certain types of scales that we suffer from in this context that folks in other places don't suffer from. And so I think these questions are articulated differently in maybe I'm just like idealizing, but from what I'm told, making art as a sort of practice does seem to be different in different social and political contexts, right? So we're kind of stuck in, no matter if we want to or don't want to think of art politically, we're really stuck with a range of possibilities that are shaped by the political context. And so I guess my question is always like, well, what do we do with those, right? How do we reckon with that? How do we get really serious about confronting the depth and scale and types of violence that are embedded in that? And where does this sort of potential for revolt and transformation come from? Did you want to say more about that?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, so I think it reminded me of something. I saw Fred Moten talk, and I think you mentioned Fred Moten. I don't know if he wrote about this, but I saw him talk, and he talked about the transformative power of barbecues. And I really, I love that idea because it's about, togetherness, right? And about sort of these, casual moments of togetherness where they're actually, completely, politically furtive, potentially. And I don't know, I think about the crisis of art today, what is that? And so I think also something that I've come as an artist to sort of realize is that you can divorce yourself from your art if you want to. There's 1,000 different ways to do it, and because I feel like my work isn't overtly political, and I always struggle with that, and I felt very guilty about that. And I think, so what I'm trying to get at is that there's in art, we're so much about abstraction and theoretical things, and we can actually have a very utilitarian viewpoint on art, and that has really helped me as an artist deciding very clearly what I think art is for. And that's why I kind of I'm a proponent of splitting yourself from your work if you want to, because it is a way to assuage that guilt. My objects and my installations aren't overtly political, but if I am, that's a way that I deal with that crisis of what can art do, because it does feel so deeply empty a lot of the time. But anyways, to go back to Fred Moten, I think there's these spontaneous moments of, and tonight is one of them, of thinking about all of these things.
Everyone has said this so brilliantly, but I think what Mike is saying too, hits for me is that, like I said, it was I think inherently there is a political act within making art that maybe isn't political, and that you are perhaps and more likely privileged, so that you don't feel that you need to put any sort of political act within your art. However, I would think that it could be a potential rousing goal within all of this is that you are not forced to put your political ideological thinkings within your art. That if you just want to make, Garfield memes, that's perfectly fine, and that in itself could be political in the fact that you are only making Garfield memes. And so I want to take the opportunity at a Platypus thing to quote Pete Buttigieg as to understand within a neoliberal context that I think what we are looking to do is political art for those who want it, which is based off his ideal of universal healthcare. I'm joking, please understand, and I just but. To that point, if he could be, a broken clock is right twice a day. So, if you could say that that does make sense. If you want to make political art, you should. If you don't, then don't. Either way, you're living to your best ideal.
Thank you. I heard multiple times about how art sort of shows the possibility of what can be. And I'm curious to personally how you guys built that conception personally in your art, or just in your practice of choosing what you want to define in the world, or what you want to see, or how you, your response to Western culture. That's all.
Can I answer that first? Yeah, I think for me, it's and maybe this is overly simplifying it, but I think that I think of art as a form of thinking, as a form of silent dialogue with myself. And so in that way, it's always about potential, always about what can be and currently isn't. Does that make sense? I know that's a really simple answer, but I think it really is that simple. It's truly just a way of thinking. Art, for me, whether it's objects, performance, music, whatever it is, protests, rallies, it's about engaging. I think it's, in a really stupidly simple way, it's about being present in the world. And that is something that all dictators, all forms of power don't want you to be present in the world. They want you to be a robot. And so that is the fundamental thing for me, is that art connects me with my humanity. It connects me with other people's humanity. And in that reverberation, the question is, how do we move forward as a group, or as two people in a room? I think that's why I like the June Jordan quote, where it basically the idea that the fundamental act of any creative process is about listening to other people, because in the act of listening, we forge our future, as cliche as that sounds. So, really good question too. Thank you.
So I quit art for a long time, and then I started trying to re-engage. So I don't have a very good answer. I think it's a struggle for me all the time to think about what the kinds of tools and commitments that I inherited from an education that taught me to care deeply about, stare at an image and agonize over the production of an image. When I shoot a video, it's frame by frame, agonizing over the quality of a particular shot. And then sort of to what extent do those attachments become sort of self-satisfying, and what extent do those attachments reproduce a kind of habits of thinking that I actually want to work against, and so what my practice is currently is it's a lot of writing essays and making videos that require essays, and taking people on walks, and thinking about the history, the political history of land use, the ways in which, I live right by the canal, and so I've spent the last 10 years making artworks about the canal, and about how come every day I can walk, on what has been, since time immemorial, a swamp. How come I sleep on solid land? How was this dry land created? When was the swamp dredged? Why was it dredged? How was it dredged? What are the forms of destruction and destructive creation that were involved in dredging the swamp and creating solid land? What does that have to do with the history of colonialism and with racialization? What of those are, they're literally buried under my feet. I'm literally walking on top of 30 feet of concrete every day, right? So I want to know about that fill material, both physically and also mentally, politically, ideologically, right? Because that fill is what enables me, what I base my daily life on. So I've been trying to do things that are very much about just being in, reckoning with the places of our everyday lives as places where a lot of this larger political questions are encoded. These larger forms of violence are actually encoded in the land as we engage with it, or in the waterways as we engage with them, right? So I lived in Florida for 10 years, so I've been doing stuff around swamps there. I've lived here next to the canal, so I do stuff around swamps here, And I don't know that it always looks like art. Sometimes it really just looks like making a zine. Sometimes it looks like taking kids on walks and doing things with young children. Sometimes it's people who have art education backgrounds who then engage in different kinds of vocabularies and stuff. But I don't think that I have a clear idea of what art I'm making and where that fits and what it should be about. And I think a lot of the political, more overtly kind of struggle politics work that I do is about the same thing too, like how come I'm here living the way I'm living, and what are the implications of that, and how can I be more present in this entangled web of forces that I'm part of, that I'm supposed to not think about. I'm supposed to, I'm finally on the winning side of capitalism. I've got documents as an American citizen now, whoop whoop. I'm not supposed to wonder very much about how this world is sort of stabilized. So hopefully that's not maybe something that's specific to art making. I think actually that's specific to how a lot of communities live every day, and maybe a lot of artists don't think that way. But I might be biased.
I'm glad we're talking about just simple things as far as our personal practices or anybody here's personal practice. I think two things that come up a lot for me for my active participation within my own life when I'm feeling good is the big things that we can try to take on, but is also the tiniest things. And so something that's given me a lot of relief and freedom is anytime my girlfriend actually made this up, Mara Lee Healy, gonna give her a shout out here. It's just that anytime she sees something in the world, she just says there's something about that and writes that down or takes a picture of it, and then there's a list she has about something abouts, and so that's something she can go back and kind of reflect on, and that kind of having that freedom in my head of being well, I know it's there, and here's this giant list of things I can kind of cull back from, which a lot of photography is kind of an adjacent thing that I'm toying with, capital P and lowercase, and that a lot of photographers go out into the world, just shoot a ton, and then they cull from that and make something, or they can go out and shoot with intention. And so kind of flexing between those two things and trying to give myself, freedom to do those things. And then beyond that, I guess one last thing that gives me a lot of joy and peace, and something I've been very curious about, is peace movements and things of that nature. But things that bring me peace in the meantime is that anytime people are at odds with their practices, I try to help my friends when they say oh my God, I haven't touched something in 10 years, I hate this, whatever. It's well, if you're not at odds with your practice at some point, did you ever actually really care that much in the first place? So if that helps anyone at all, I don't know, but I feel just on the simpler side of being a practicing artist, or in just being amongst the art world or whatever it may be, those have helped me. And also, yes, we should all go to barbecues and have those more often.
I'm going to ask a quick question here. I'm going to ask a very vulgar question. because you brought up, Micah, that there is part of how you deal with making art is you kind of separate yourself from it to a certain extent. Maybe it's like out of guilt. So we already drew this line earlier that there seems to be this through line of the 60s throughout a lot of you guys' remarks. But obviously the question of art and politics is something that goes back much further. In the 60s, they did not invent it. We have the Benjamin quote from the 30s in the panel description. So I'm going to quote a different thing from Benjamin, but not actually him. It's a conversation he had with Brecht, which is funny for me in particular because you kind of look like Brecht, Micah. Yes. But so Brecht tells Benjamin that he had a kind of fantasy of being put at the front of like a military tribunal at the height of like the Stalinist trials. And the tribunal in this fantasy asks him, it's like, what are you committed to? Like, final straw, yes or no? Are you committed to the political revolution or are you committed to art? And it's like interesting that Brecht's the guy who asked this because he's like we're going to make like the political theater type of thing. And in his fantasy, he gets to finally like say once and for all, if I have to choose between the two of them, I'm committed to art. Now, all of you are artists, except Rosalinda, you're a recovering artist, according to your own description. Retired artist. But at the end of the day, there does seem to be this like tension there of like, oh, well, like, my work is just basically upholding the system that it purportedly proposes. But at the end of the day, like, where do you all believe that you stand on this? Is it the question of like the political struggle, or is it the work that you're doing? What do you see that the work you're doing is doing at all?
I think I can come back to your question while also answering this one. So I facetiously in my little bio that I submitted for this said I was a retired artist, but it's there's some truth to it. So I've been making art, I don't know, a couple of decades. And I used to think, as I got into teaching, I used to think that teaching was my day job. That was the way I supported myself as an artist. And then over time, and I don't know exactly when this happened, when the light bulb went on, but I started to realize that what was going on in the classroom was a lot closer to what I wanted an art engagement and interaction to be like than any art thing I'd ever done or, in fact, seen or been involved in any way. The classroom was really the kind of interaction that I yearned for and the kind of interaction that I believe in. People sitting down, at SAIC for 3 hours. When I first got hired here and they told me they were 3-hour classes, I was like, holy crap, how am I going to do a 3-hour class? But now it doesn't seem like enough time. But to sit down for 3 hours together in a room, face to face, having maybe read the same stuff, looked at the same stuff, and talk that stuff through, what it means to us, what it does to us, how it feels, that's really what I think the ideal interaction is. Aesthetically, politically, they sort of merge at that point. And so what's happened with my thinking about this is I used to think that I was a teacher to support myself as an artist. Then I was like an artist to support myself as a teacher, and now I've got tenure, so I retired from the art part. I don't need it anymore. I can just do what I think really is effective and what really works, and what anyone who's taught will tell you that there's these moments where something happens, something changes in the room, in a person, in a conversation, in a relationship, and that's what I always wanted to happen in art, but it doesn't happen very much, for reasons we've all touched on already here. So, so in terms of the question you asked about affecting some kind of transformation, the classroom is where I think I'm able to do it. Other people can do it in other settings, but it's the place where I feel like it happens the most in terms of my own engagement, my own involvement. And I would say is everyone here affiliated with SAIC? Pretty much, not everybody, some of you. Those of you who are, there should be more pushback, especially among the student body, against the professionalization, we might even call it the neoliberalization of this institution. It's just out of hand. And I see very little friction, very little resistance, and somebody ought to be pushing back. And if anybody wants to initiate that or help me initiate that, it should happen. So I'll just throw that in unsolicited.
Yeah, I think that's so important, actually, the idea of deprofessionalizing it, because it ultimately is a question of what is art, right? Like, and I think something that connects everything that we've said is this idea of like feeling deeply moved by something. You're saying you found it in the classroom. It sounds like you're finding it in the world. I struggle because I want to find that in fucking objects and in exhibitions. And so I think a lot about, what is art? And I sometimes call my own practice a religion of one, because it's something that I wake up to and do no matter if anyone is looking. And I think that's really something that professionalization of art completely kills, and it's meant to kill. And even art schools are a completely modern, recent thing. And, they have become machines to produce people who have CVs. Like, fuck your CV, just make art. And I mean, because you brought up going back, in terms of like the 30s and Benjamin and Brecht, but I mean, you can go back even further than that. I think this shift from in painting, of all things, for example, from painters painting for the church and painting from the Bible, started to paint the peasantry because they saw the sublimity and the beauty of the medieval peasantry. And I mean, to make the peasantry, the subject was profane, and we see that now as like, we see these paintings, and I don't think we have a really true understanding of like how radical they would have been in their moment. I mean, I think about the painting Burial at Arnon, for example. It's like the subject of these paintings at the time were radical and were being made by people who were deeply moved by the beauty and the poetic, symbolic things they saw in front of them. So, I mean, I don't know where I was going with that, but I think the idea of being deeply moved by your own practice is something that I never learned in school, because it was about, understandably, like, part of school is learning a technique. Thank God there's theory in art history classes, and it sounds like there's still good teachers in art schools, obviously. But that aspect of it is like so important, like really like what the fuck moves you? Like, what is the point of art if not to be moved? And I actually have a quote, I know it's kind of tacky, by... It's not, actually. No, actually it's not. No, it's my favorite philosopher, Emile Choron, and it's really short. But he says, and this is from his book, A Short History of Decay, "If but one drop of what I feel were to fall into hell," said Catherine of Genoa, "it would forthwith transform hell into paradise." Like, one drop. And I think like that's like really how I approach art. This idea of just like completely giving in to like emotion, feeling, and passion, because these things seem to be completely antithetical to our current epoch, right? Like, as much as we are in this weird sort of like era of self-help, we actually despise feeling, we despise passion. I'm talking very generally at large, obviously. So for me, that's how I recoup this idea of art, is that it's a personal religion of poetry, in front of which I am meant to weep and quiver and shake as a small, disgusting human being. And that's how I get up and sleep at night. I don't know if that helps, but why not be fucking impassioned, and like, art is so amazing.
Hello. Thank you. Micah Schippa was in the beginning talking about the role of the curator, and how difficult it is to not act as a puppet of the institution and helping the system again to exist. And I was then, that brought me, like, I was thinking about the role of the artist and how he might do this as well, choosing like iconic ways of working and like putting the work on a pedestal, choosing the white cube to present the art. And then and I was wondering for answers to kind of don't use this in your practice without forgetting about it, or like within the tradition of art history or art in general. So maybe the discussion is very open, but maybe you can answer as personally as you answered the other questions.
So I think I'm having a little bit of trouble understanding your question. Like, so you're asking, like, how as an artist do you maintain a sense of like yourself, like in putting your art into a white cube context, or?
Yes, I mean, we as artists, I think we do a little bit the same like the curator. We kind of have rules we achieve, like do all the time, and also I don't know, just, I mean, social media puts algorithms on us, but we are also doing the algorithms by ourselves, and it is kind of easy to work inside of this frame because it works. And I guess this is the case in, like, you know, like you can have this in all kind of frames where you exhibit your work. And I wonder, for ways, it's a personal interest, and to like choose to escape those fields, but I also need to, or I have the feeling that I also want to enact as an artist in the tradition of art, and this is
You're asking how can you have your cake and eat it too, I think. I mean, yeah, because I feel the same exact way. Like, there's this, like, very formulaic systems of, like, white cube, posting your shows, having titles, getting people to attend, you know, whatever, that whole system, and then wanting to do something that's completely, like, antagonistic to that. So I don't have an answer. I think that you're already, in a way, more than halfway there because you're asking the question, and that's like how I feel, is that, you know, I think a lot about, like, for example, project spaces, like in Chicago, the first thing they do is they immediately start to emulate, and this happens everywhere, not just Chicago, but project spaces, which are supposed to be these sort of autonomous experimental zones, start to immediately emulate the commercial gallery system and everything about it. And it's like, no, like, play, like, have fun, you know. And so I think if you're running a space, or if you're an artist, just posing those questions and forcing there to be a zone of more freedom, I think, and even just asking the question at all is like a good place to start. I know that's not like a great answer, but
I think there's so many different traditions of what art could be, right? And I think as soon as you create other institutions and other social contexts, you create new possibilities. And so these dilemmas, I feel what you're saying because I'm in the same dilemmas, you know, but these dilemmas are in a way created by this sort of the lack of options that we have. You know, there's such, like, in this incredibly wealthy place, there's like such paucity of real possibility, you know. And so I don't, you know, I think it's unfortunate that we feel like our options are either to, as we're already doing, right? There's already a curator in your head. There's already a cop in your head, kill the cop in your head, by the way, everybody. Maybe the curator too. So we're already have internalized these structures, right? And then we also want to be outside of them, but we also want to be inside of them. And so there's like this sort of unsolvable dilemma, but like those are not the only options. Right? The problem is that we don't have the possibility to collectively, with other people, create other options and constantly recreate those options and constantly destabilize them so they don't become ossified and they don't become amenable to capture and they don't become just another way of like destroying, right, worlds and universes, through financialization and all that, But I don't think that as an individual person, I can't resolve that. I just experience that contradiction and split. But it's not resolvable at an individual level. It's resolvable at a level of social imagination that's shared and built with others.
Yeah, if I could just add on, Rosalind, I think you said that beautifully, and I totally agree. But I think this goes back to something that was in the prompt that we haven't addressed at all yet, which is there was something about a model of subjectivity in the prompt. And, this is one of the big problems, not only with art, but with, living under capitalism, living in the kind of distorted democracy that we live in this country. That too much of it is based on the notion, the kind of fiction of individual will, that, you should be able to figure this out and solve it for yourself. But that's not how it's going to happen. That's not how it works. And, Mike, I appreciate your sentiments, but I think the phrase religion of one made me bristle a little bit, because if we all are functioning as artists or as people, as religions of one, nothing's going to change, So I think we have to, I'm not really interested in religion, but we have to function as organizations of collective organizations, not organizations of one. And as Rosalinda very eloquently, much more eloquently than I'm doing it, said, it has to be the institutions that shift and change in order to allow alternatives to the quandary you find yourself in, that we all find ourselves in. And again, it's not just art, It's everything.
There's so many hands. That's great.
Hey there. So I agree with everything you guys have said, and it does can you guys hear me well?
Yeah.
Yeah, closer? Okay, there we go. I agree with everything you guys have said. I feel like it does encapsulate the landscape. The problem at the core is a sense of alienation in the field of art, which was supposed to be all about attaining the self and feeling connected to nature, to oneself. Overall, you guys were describing that protest art and this denunciation or this questioning has also led to that alienation. The institutions as well, I feel like it's their responsibility to help guide people in this need to create, this hobby that for now is glorified. And because we don't understand it, we don't understand why we create, we don't know if we're a witness or if we're a communicator or an instigator or martyr. People want to pursue the fine arts route because that's the main model we have. But as you said, there's a wavering between wanting to be a fine artist, but also wanting to be yourself and creating art for yourself. So, and because of this, there's been there's like this response that you guys were describing that we should create art that isn't about that isn't political, essentially. For those who do want to pursue a fine arts career and be a fine artist in the traditional sense, what would the new movement in response to this alienation look like? What would be the characteristics, and what would that art not be?
I want to say I never said don't make art that's political. I actually kind of question what's the politics of our institutions and our understandings of art. And I guess I wonder, right, what, I guess that's the question for those of us who have like deep-seated attachments to specific kind of media, you know, and like can lose ourselves. And, you know, I used to be a sculptor for decades, and that had something to do with my physical engagement with particular materials, and I could just live my whole life like that, right? And felt that was, you know, I could be satisfied by that, you know. For me, living in this country as a person without documents and largely unhoused during undergrad and grad school, the art career was not like a solid option. Like the dream that you can actually survive that way was never, I could never believe it because it wasn't for people like me, right? But it was always like a sort of romantic desire, you know, what if I could just literally just be like Brancusi, where I could just live in my pajamas and carve, you know? And so, I mean, I wonder about that. Is that about escaping a certain set of circumstances, or is that about looking for space where a particular engagement with materiality is supported and is allowed, you know? How about looking for spaces where particular engagements with other people, particular relationalities with other people, and cultivating a web of relations that is not the individual? What if that was actually allowed and possible as a way of life that we could thrive in, whatever that ends up being, like as a salary or professional thing? I mean, I grew up in a country, Romania was poor and dictatorial and all that, but there was universal income, you know? You could be an artist and get a salary and do nothing. Like you'd be like this all day and think, and you were an artist and you had a salary, right? Your whole life. So there are, even in my own lifetime, there are many different ways in which this thing called an artist, even as an occupation, could actually look and be structured and be seen as being integrated in a social fabric. The market option that we have here isn't the only one. So I don't know what the movement visually would look like, stylistically, but I think it would be interesting if the movement included a kind of remaking of the very institutions and channels and spaces of art itself, so that makers would have a different array of possibilities. And also different people that we don't recognize as artists could be part of the conversation too.
Hi. Okay, so thinking about like art and specifically like the print studio as instrumental to political change, especially like during and after the moments of like Marxism, and like thinking about like places where revolution happened and like with the Bolsheviks and whatnot. Thinking about like print media as this essential, like one of the essential vehicles for political change. Let's see what I wrote here. What can a contemporary form of agitprop take that isn't within the sphere of Orange Man Bad and notorious RBG printmaking that is both tone deaf and contributes to liberal identity politics, as well as is 8x10 and $60. What does political art that is publicly accessible look like outside of, say, the breadth of like arts for the arts world and cohort, whether that be research-based practices like forensic architecture or studio practices like the Astor Gates in an era post-Guerrilla Girls, I guess. Like what can that look like now?
No, I'm the old member of the panel. It's not my job to answer that question.
No, it's rock and roll. I think there's a lot of really very cool examples, actually. I'm thinking about, I don't know, have you seen Un Violador en su camino? there's all of these like Chilean street performance art, sort of Chilean feminist artists and researchers that are doing these pretty fabulous and interesting street performances, and that are developing like whole genres of street performance that are specifically around both creating narratives and sort of breaking the boundaries between participant and witness, and also, strategically occupying the space of the street or the plaza, right? So the arrangement of bodies corresponds to the dimensions of the street, so that a confrontation with the pigs can happen. It's really inventive and really weird and wild, and it's kind of viral. It's like going viral all over, certain parts of the world, and people know it. It was done in Chicago because a lot of the folks from Central America who are based in Chicago and who are connected to those kinds of artistic traditions really wanted to re-perform it here. So you'll find it online if you Google un violador en tu camino. It's in English, it's a rapist in your path, right? So that's like, for me, an example of a whole range of performative and visual practices that emerge in the context of really interesting, also political revolt. I think there's still a lot of really interesting print media that happens, and it happens in relation to most of the social movements in Mexico, including kind of the National Indigenous Congress and the various organizations that are part of that, and the different kinds of cross-border print collective collaboratives that are involved, for instance, in the sort of femicide kind of art making, or like art making against femicide movements. They're also super interesting, and they're not performative. They're kind of based in graphics media, and they're based in a kind of sort of radically opening up graphics media to different kinds of participation and different forms of learning and teaching each other among people and communities of people who don't identify as artists or have never had an art background. And I think some of the work is really beautiful. There's a lot of embroidery that's also part of that kind of very contemporary, very radical art tradition, but that uses what would be considered feminized media, like embroidery. I think there's a lot of in what are sort of the vibrant and sort of really happening kind of struggle movements today. I think they do generate, alongside of them or as part of them, really interesting and complex kind of forms of artistic expression. I think it's hard for us to be familiar with them from afar, right? Because they don't necessarily circulate through the same channels. And so this is where we're deprived of a lot of these kind of models. But I think, we make up our own models, and we can see a lot of them closer, sort of like become familiar with the movements that are closer to us, and sort of experiment along and say, we may not have a single solution or genre, but, we can always kind of try new things and see what really happens if you really challenge the conventional modes of engagement with others through something that might be considered a creative medium.
I think if I was going to talk about things that are giving me hope, things that I'm excited about, one thing that's affiliated with the podcast I mentioned, but it's this group called Do Not Research, and it's an online collective of hundreds of artists, and they've done it pretty much resides through Discord, and I feel like if we weren't to mention the URL collectives, the URL spaces to kind of connect with one another, we'd be not doing a 2023 talk. But to that end, what they do, I guess as loosely as possible, is that it's a predominantly, I would say, leftist progressive coalition of people with kind of a foundational text of it would be Mark Fisher's capitalist realism. And there's all kinds of people in it, and it doesn't mean that that's necessarily the way that you must abide to be part of it. However, being a part of their Discord, which I pay $5 to be a part of a Patreon, there's all these subsections on the side of show your own work, art discussions, but then music, you name it. And honestly, as a lifelong Midwesterner, I see that a lot of these people tend to live in, major market areas of art, especially like New York, LA, Berlin, something like that. And something that's been really fun is to kind of find people that are even in, the flyover states of the Midwest. But then Chicago, I think, being such a ripe and amazing place for innovation. And I think what's kind of promising, I think people say that millennials sort of look at the world as sort of like, God, everything sucks, nothing matters. And then Gen Z is like, oh my God, nothing matters. This rules, a doomer to bloomer kind of experience. And I tend to, I'm not a Gen Z person, but I identify with that thinking, in that I think the fact that a lot of us don't really have the answers is an incredibly exciting time. And I think, to use industry terms of like, there's a space to have market capture of what we intend to do going forward, and that kind of whatever you want to do, you should try to get into that and then fail, because like you can. And it's something I've been told by people in the art world here, is that like Chicago is a town where you can really get after something and make an incredible career, but also you can fail, and that's okay. And so to your point though, the question before about kind of experiencing kind of everything we're talking about tonight, of just like experiencing the curator inside, the cop inside, whatever, to focus on the curator. I think we should kill it, certainly, but also we should maybe even try forgiving first. And, when we are given so few options outside of, being able to fund our lives with everything increasing in price, going to school is incredibly expensive, doing anything, lunch is now $20, whatever you want to say, is that like, if you're wanting to use something that you're good at, and maybe that's art, and you want to sell it, but then people are pointing at you saying, well, now you don't have perfect rhetoric, that's kind of what I'm trying to get to. So I think first, let's maybe forgive ourselves first. Also check out Do Not Research. Okay.
Okay, last question. But if you guys could be so kind as to fold in your closing remarks into this last question, because we're nearly out of time. So yeah.
Okay. I wanted to push the question, or the problem that I think is haunting this panel again, namely the issue of the 60s. I was thinking about Stuart Martin's critique of relational aesthetics, and how he recognized that relational aesthetics recognizes sort of contradiction in social relations under capitalism, but that it, instead of dealing with the question that it posed, that the contradiction posed, namely one of a political revolution, that it became a new form of accommodation under capitalism. And again, I think a running theme here was that against the individual, we should turn outwards to the collective. And my question is this a new form of accommodating under capitalism in lieu of a political revolution?
So all of you, because closing remarks.
Absolutely. I think there's a whole kind of interest in collectivism in art that has, created lots of careers for art collectives, that it's become, basically they're really clever enterprises that are very successful. So I think there are there are waves of interest in collectivism that are specifically about being accommodationist and kind of diffusing the threats that these sort of challenges to the individual pose. I think, I guess I wonder about how we define social revolution and how we work towards it. I don't think of revolution as an event. I think of it as a really long process. And I wonder, how do we build up the scales of social struggle that start to feel like they are potentially opening up the possibility of radical change at a structural level. And so I think, in preparation for that, right, how do we kind of continuously prepare ourselves for the possibility of radical systemic change on a daily basis, as opposed to waiting for some mythical revolution that may or may not come? Revolutions are made by people, I guess, and I also have a bit of a distrust in a revolutionary model that assumes a singular event, that happens and then it's over. So I wonder, what if we were to sort of see ourselves as needing to be part of a revolutionary project already, right? but just the phase that it's in is a phase in which like collective energies still have to be gathered, desires still have to be mobilized, forms of collectivizing and mutual support still have to be leveraged, so that we can ask these questions, so we can like leave this sort of individual dilemma, the realm of the individual dilemma and the individual contradiction that we're sort of helpless within, and actually find spaces of kind of collective, transformation. And I don't think every form of collectivity has to be accommodationist. I don't think every form of, there's the idea of like reform towards radical change or reform towards like accommodation, right? So what are the kind of the transformative steps that maybe get us closer and closer to possibilities of change, as opposed to being just another way that the system recoups us and all our desires and kind of turns them around.
Does anybody else? Yeah, I think that is a really good question, because we should be skeptical of any commodification in that way. And I think, Claire Bishop kind of talks about this too in Artificial Hells. And I think what you're pinpointing is very real. And I think that's kind of why I brought up a religion of one, because collective is just a group of individuals, right? Like we can't platform one over the other. I think it's a sonic or reverberatory relationship between the two, because you can't change the outside without changing the inside. Or maybe there's only the outside, maybe those definitions explode. I don't know. And I think, when I say religion, it's a shorthand way of saying an internal symbolic order, right? Because I think that we're just we're taught in our system to just be robotic and go about our lives without, considering anything. So I think it's just about that. It's kind of exploding both categories, which I don't really know what the end result of that looks like. I mean, I guess it's kind of dialectical materialism, right? Like it's like this constant reverberation between synthesis, thesis, and antithesis. But in terms of what that actually looks like in praxis, I'm not sure if it's even worth trying to define. Maybe that's the point, is that there isn't a universal, and that things can happen simultaneously, almost in a way that kind of organic cells operate in nature, where things can coalesce, die, become cancerous, form into organs. Maybe it's all of those things kind of at the same time. So I think just escaping any kind of universal narrative is usually a way, the only way out is through, I guess, in that way. Asking better questions, I think, too, in our own practice, as artists, not obviously your specific question, but I think part of what I feel is these questions of the collective and the individual, they're not enough. We have to be asking all of the questions that we've asked here tonight. And so I think maybe in praxis, more talks, more togetherness, more reading groups. This is really, to me, where the magic, events like this is where the magic of art kind of happens, which is cliche and tacky sounding, but I stand by it.
I fiercely agree in terms of, as I read online, people use the term de-virtualize, to de-virtualize your life, and also sort of, I think in a post-internet world, de-virtualize your mind, because there were already rules and regulations in the universe or under capitalism before the advent of the internet. But let's say in our contemporary world of Instagram specifically, we're artists. This is the sort of universe we live within. That's the marketplace of ideas in some ways, depending, and maybe some of you live in the digital version of a small farm somewhere, but all better to you. But for that reason, I think I completely agree. Being able to connect IRL is fiercely important. Keeping your small list of something about, and understanding that, maybe a collective of is like, I think somebody said, like body parts. If the heart is not fully the heart all the time, then it can't really function because it can't do half a job of being like the spleen or something. I don't know. But a point being is that I do think that things like this and all of you being here today is fiercely important. So I thank you all for that. And I'm very grateful to have been amongst everyone here today.
I want to just start by saying that the notion that relational aesthetics was ever a revolutionary project is complete bullshit. Those artists had no interest in revolution. Even Nicola Borio, who kind of theorized what they were doing and gave them sort of imposed upon them a much stronger political set of motivations than they actually had. Even he wasn't interested in anything along the lines of revolution. So I don't know that there's any need to push back against that. But really, I mean, I think the crucial thing here, and it seems to be coming up in a lot of the comments and questions, is that the only way to address some of these issues and frustrations that we've been voicing, it can't be done through individual action. It's because we live in a set of nested systems and institutions that dictate the rules of the game that we're playing, or the games, plural, that we're playing. It's not necessarily a question of individuality versus collective, individual versus collective. It's really a question of finding ways to affect those systems and those institutions. And that happens in lots of different ways and in lots of different places. When I talked at the very beginning about kind of diffuse cause and effect, changing people's minds through a classroom experience, reading a novel, attending a talk, having a conversation at a barbecue or on the L or wherever, where something shifts, and we've all experienced this, something shifts in our conceptions of ourselves and of the world in which we live. If those things, like dominoes, start to fall, then action starts to accrue. But it has to happen at the level, and this is something I don't think the world understands well enough, that it has to happen at the level of these institutions and systems. If we can't change the very presumptions of what it means to be alive, what it means to be a human, what it means to be American, what it means to be gay, what it means to be a teacher, what it means to be a student, etc., all down the line, if we can't affect the presumptions and the restrictions, both overt and covert, that are implied in all of those institutions, definitions, systemizations, then we can't really change anything. It can't happen at the level of the individual. Neoliberalism wants us all to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. You can't do it. It doesn't work. You can't get yourself off the ground. So it can't happen at the individual level. It has to happen through alterations, modifications, revolutions at the systemic level.
Okay. Huge thank you to our panelists for their remarks. Let's give a round of applause.